a soldier on the last day of the march can see water. Not close enough to drink, just close enough to know it's there. The Sea of Galilee sits in the distance, flat and bright under a July sun, and every man in the column has been staring at it for hours. Somewhere behind him, thousands of others are doing the same thing. Knights in mail, foot soldiers, mule drivers, priests carrying relics, all of them walking toward a lake they will never reach. Remember that lake. We'll come back to it. This is the summer of 1187, and the army marching across these hills belongs to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It is, in theory, one of the strongest forces the kingdom has ever assembled. Nearly every knight, foot soldier, and mercenary the crown can muster, gathered to save a city under siege. In practice, it is already dying, not from wounds, from thirst. 3 days earlier, this same army was camped at Sephoria, next to natural springs, with shade, with water for every horse and every man. Sephoria was safe, Sephoria was defensible, and the army left it anyway. To understand why, you have to understand what was actually happening, not just on the battlefield, but inside the tents where the decisions were made. Because the man leading this army, King Guy of Lusignan, was not simply outmaneuvered by a brilliant enemy general. He was maneuvered by his own advisors first. The war that mattered most in this campaign wasn't fought with swords. It was fought with arguments inside a war council, days before anyone saw an enemy soldier. And the man on the other side of the hills, waiting, already knew exactly how this argument would end. His name was Saladin, and he had spent years learning something most commanders of his era never fully grasped. You don't have to defeat an army in battle if you can make it defeat itself first. By the time this story ends, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's entire field army will be gone. Not scattered, gone, and Jerusalem itself, the city this army marched out to protect, will fall within months. But the moment that decided all of it wasn't a clash of swords at all. It was a decision made beside a spring at a place called Sephoria by men who thought they still had time. Saladin did not want Tiberius, not really. He wanted the army that would come to save it. For years, Saladin had been building something rare in the Muslim world of his time, a single, unified command stretching from Cairo to Damascus. He had spent a decade fighting rival emirs as much as Crusaders, absorbing city after city under his own banner, because he understood a simple truth. A divided force, however brave, loses to a unified one eventually. He intended to be the unified one. By the summer of 1187, Saladin had gathered an army that likely outnumbered the Crusaders significantly, and he pointed it at Tiberias, a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, ruled by Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Eschiva. Raymond, at that moment, was not in Tiberias. He was at Sephoria, with the rest of the Crusader leadership. His own wife was under siege, and he still argued against marching to save her. That single detail tells you almost everything about what kind of commander Raymond was, and how badly the coming decision would go against his advice. Here's the domain term worth knowing. Saladin was fighting on interior lines. That means he could move his forces, resupply them, and choose his ground faster than the Crusaders could respond, because he was operating close to his own territory. The Crusaders, by contrast, would have to travel through hostile, waterless country just to reach him. Interior lines don't win battles by themselves. They win the terrain the battle gets fought on. And terrain, in this campaign, would matter more than anything else. Inside the war tent at Sephoria, the air was already thick with heat before anyone raised their voice. Men in armor packed into canvas walls under a summer sun tend to argue faster than men who are comfortable. Raymond stood and told the council plainly, "Do not march. Tiberias can be retaken later." A besieged town is not worth losing an army over. He knew this land. He knew there was no reliable water between Sephoria and Tiberias in the dry season, only a long, exposed ridge road under open sky. He had fought Saladin before. He understood, better than almost anyone else in that tent, what thirst does to soldiers wearing 40 pounds of iron in July heat. Most of the council agreed with him. For a moment, it looked like caution would win. Then Gerard de Riedfort spoke. Gerard, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood close to the king, his voice pitched to carry. His hand resting on the hilt of a sword he had no intention of drawing in that tent. He and Raymond had old history, old rivalries, old humiliations, a grudge that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with pride. He accused Raymond of cowardice. He accused him, some accounts suggest, of something close to treason, of caring more about his wife's political standing than about the honor of the kingdom. He pushed King Guy hard, reminding him of an earlier moment when Guy had held back from battle and been mocked for it ever since. King Guy was not a strong king. He had come to the throne through marriage, not through the kind of battlefield reputation that silences doubters. And in that tent, surrounded by men questioning his courage for the second time in 2 years, he made his choice. March. By morning, the army that had been safe beside the springs of Sephoria was moving east, toward Tiberias, toward the enemy, toward a stretch of country with almost no water at all. Saladin didn't have to trick anyone into this. He simply had to wait for men who already distrusted each other to make the worst possible version of their own argument. Here is the part worth sitting with for a second. The battle that destroyed the kingdom of Jerusalem's army wasn't decided by Saladin's cavalry, or his archers, or his tactics on the day of the fighting. It was decided the moment that army walked away from water it could still reach, because 2 men in a tent couldn't stop arguing with each other long enough to think clearly. That's the pattern running through this entire story. Command decisions made under pressure, made to protect pride instead of people, don't just risk a battle. They can decide it in advance, before either side has drawn a weapon. If you're the kind of person who likes seeing exactly how disasters like this get built piece by piece, this channel does that every week. Subscribe if you want the next one, and drop a comment if you've ever watched a bad decision get made in real time and known, right away, how it was going to end. Now watch what happens once that army actually starts moving. The road out of Sephoria looks fine on a map. In July, on the ground, it is a different kind of country. There is almost no shade. The hills are dry, scraped bare by summer heat, and the only route toward Tiberias runs along an exposed ridge with no reliable water source for most of its length. The Crusader army, likely somewhere around 20,000 men, including several thousand knights in full mail armor, set out into that country on the morning of July 3rd. By midday, the temperature had likely climbed well past 40 degrees Celsius. Mail armor does something specific in heat like that. It doesn't just sit on the body. It holds the heat against the skin, turning each knight into something closer to an oven than a soldier. Add the weight of shields, weapons, and supplies, and the marching pace slows before anyone even sees an enemy rider. That's when Saladin's cavalry appeared, not in one mass charge, in waves. This is what military logistics writers, like the historian John France, describe as attrition by harassment. Small, fast strikes designed not to destroy an army outright, but to slow it, exhaust it, and pull it further from safety with every hour that passes. You could hear them before you saw them, hooves on dry ground, then the short hiss of arrows through hot air. Saladin's horsemen rode close enough to loose arrows into the column, then peeled away before the heavier Crusader knights could catch them. A soldier near the rear of the column shook his waterskin and heard nothing but the sound of empty leather. Every time the column tried to push forward with any speed, riders appeared on the flanks. Every time it tried to change direction toward known water sources, the same thing happened. The Crusaders were never allowed to simply march. They were forced to fight for every mile, in full armor, under full sun, with their water running out, dust catching in their throats until swallowing itself became work. By the end of the first full day, they had not reached Tiberias. They had barely covered half the ground they needed to. Someone in command made the call to halt for the night near a village called Mescana, a location with no meaningful water supply at all. Think about that for a moment. An army of thousands, many already suffering from heat and thirst, stopped for the night beside dry ground, with the lake they were marching towards still hours away. The horses suffered first. War horses need enormous amounts of water, more than most people realize. And by the second morning, some were already too weak to carry their riders at full strength. Soldiers were rationing what little they had left, sip by sip, watching the sun climb again, with the knowledge that today would be worse than yesterday. And Saladin's forces did something else that night, something almost simple in its cruelty. They set fire to the dry brush and grass surrounding the Crusader camp. The wind did the rest. Smoke rolled into a camp already choking on thirst and heat, stinging eyes, catching in throats already dry from a full day without enough water. Men who hadn't slept, who hadn't eaten properly, who had marched all day under armor in summer heat, now spent the night breathing smoke instead of resting. By the time the sun rose on July 4th, this was no longer a disciplined army moving toward a battle. It was a column of exhausted, dehydrated men who had one goal left in their minds, and it wasn't victory. It was water, and ahead of them, visible now on the horizon, sat two rocky hills rising out of the dry ground. A landmark local herders had used for generations, known simply as the Horns. By the morning of July 4th, the Crusader army had stopped functioning as one force. It was still moving, it was still armed, but an army that hasn't had real water in nearly 2 days doesn't march anymore. It stumbles forward on momentum and fear, and momentum was running out fast. Saladin's forces had spent the night positioning themselves exactly where they needed to be, between the Crusaders and the Sea of Galilee, closing the last possible route to water before the sun even rose. This is the moment worth remembering, that lake we mentioned at the very beginning. It's still there, still visible, closer even than it had been the day before. And now, completely unreachable. Saladin's cavalry didn't need to charge in force. They simply held the ground between a dying army and the one thing it needed to survive. Every attempt the Crusaders made to break through toward the shore was met with the same wall of horsemen, the same arrows, the same retreat and return pattern that had worn them down for 2 straight days. Then came the smoke again, thicker this time, deliberately set upwind of the Crusader position, rolling directly into the twin hills, where the surviving formation had pulled back to try to regroup. Those hills are the reason this battle carries the name it does. 2 volcanic rises, close together, rough and rocky, known ever since as the Horns of Hattin. And here's what the terrain did that no general could have planned around perfectly. Not even Raymond, who knew this land better than anyone in that original war council. The two hills split the Crusader force. Infantry pulled one way, knights pulled another. Command structure that had barely survived the march now broke apart on ground that made it physically impossible for the army to fight as a single body. This is not a story about heavy armor failing in heat. This is not a story about one bad tactical order. This is a story about an army that had already lost, over 2 days and one bad decision, the one resource that made fighting possible at all. Raymond of Tripoli, watching the formation disintegrate around him, made a choice that has been debated by historians ever since. Some accounts describe him charging directly through Saladin's lines with a small group of knights. Whether as a genuine breakout attempt, or, as some later accused, an act of self-preservation, the sources disagree, and the truth likely died with the men who were there. What's certain is that he escaped the field. Most of the army did not. The infantry, cut off from the knights, without water, surrounded on ground with no clear escape route, began to collapse. Some accounts describe soldiers throwing down their weapons simply to lie on the ground, past the point of caring what happened next. Under a hot July sky, dehydration doesn't just weaken a body. It takes the fight out of a mind. King Guy made his final stand near the top of one of the two hills, beneath his own red tent, alongside the relic his army had carried the entire way. A fragment of wood believed by the Crusaders to be part of the true cross, carried into battle as a promise of God's protection. Men whose lips had cracked from 2 days, without enough water, still fought around that tent, because the relic gave the collapse one last thing to defend. That promise did not hold. By the time the fighting ended, King Guy of Lusignan had been captured. The true cross had been captured. Nearly the entire field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The force that had marched out of Sephoria 3 days earlier, strong, provisioned, and whole, no longer existed. There's a version of military history, told again and again across different centuries, where an army stops being a fighting force long before the final blow lands, because the thing sustaining it, food, water, fuel, morale, ran out first. Napoleon's army didn't die in one battle on the road out of Moscow. It died gradually, over hundreds of miles, worn down by cold and hunger, before Russian forces ever needed to finish the job. Hattin belongs to that same, older lesson. Saladin understood something simple and brutal. Control the water, and the battle is already decided. Jerusalem did not fall at Hattin. Not technically. The city itself held out for a few more months, its walls still standing, its gates still shut. But the army that could have defended it was gone, and everyone on both sides knew what that meant. Saladin moved through the kingdom's undefended territory with almost no resistance left to slow him. City after city surrendered without a real fight, because there was no field army left to relieve them. By October of that same year, Jerusalem surrendered too. The city didn't fall in October. It fell in July on a dry hillside, days before anyone reached its walls. That's the first thing worth taking from this story. The most important moment in a disaster is rarely the moment everyone remembers. It's usually earlier, quieter, and far less dramatic than the ending it causes. Here's the second thing. Most of the men who died of thirst and exhaustion on that march had no voice in the argument that sent them there. They didn't choose Sephoria. They didn't choose the march. They followed orders shaped by 2 men protecting their pride inside a tent, and they paid for that pride with their lives. That pattern shows up any time people with power let ego drive a decision that other people have to survive. And here's the last one, the one that stays with you. An army can carry its holiest relic into battle, believing completely that it guarantees protection, and still lose everything within a single day. Faith held the Crusader line together for 2 days of thirst and smoke and harassment. It did not hold the line at Hattin. What decided that battle wasn't belief. It was water, terrain, and a command decision made 3 days too early. News of Hattin reached Europe within months, and it didn't just shock people. It changed the entire direction of the crusading movement. Kings who had stayed home for a decade started raising new armies. Within 2 years, the Third Crusade was underway, built almost entirely on the shock of what had happened at a place most Europeans had never heard of before that summer. So here's the question worth sitting with. Every disaster in this story came from a decision made under pressure by people who thought they still had time to fix it later. Which part of this one would you have argued against if you'd been standing in that tent at Sephoria? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the battle that decides everything isn't the one with the swords in it. It's the one that happens 3 days earlier, beside a spring nobody thought they needed to protect.